I'm Michel Martin with NPR News, and along with St. Louis Public Radio, we welcome you to Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later. We are gathered at Greater St. Mark Family Church in St. Louis. It's a few minutes north of where Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed on August 9th, 2014 by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson. The killing sparked protests and demands for reform locally and nationally. We're here for a conversation with panelists and community members to talk about what happened and why, and to look at what has and has not changed in the last 10 years. Joining us are Ferguson Mayor Ella Jones. In 2020, Jones, who was a city council member, was voted into office as the city's first Black mayor and first woman to serve in the position. Brittany Packnett-Cunningham is an activist, educator, writer, and former member of the Ferguson Commission. She now lives in Washington, D.C. Ferguson Police Chief Troy Doyle is here tonight. He was sworn in as Ferguson's Chief of Police in March 2023 after more than 3 decades with the St. Louis County Police Department. Clifton Kinney is an educator, a Ferguson protester, and the founder of Our Destiny STL. That's a network of young activists across Missouri who organize statewide and national school walkouts. And Zach Boyers is the chairman and CEO of U.S. Bancorp Impact Finance, which provides financial support and more equitable access to capital to communities in St. Louis and across the U.S. Welcome to you all. You know, we've been here all week, as I mentioned, and a number of my colleagues came from Washington with me, and we've been asking everybody the same question, which is, where were you on August 9th of 2014? And if you would just briefly tell me, where were you, and how did you hear what happened, and what did you hear? Clifton, I'll just start with you.
Wow. First of all, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. This is important. It's an important time for us to really come together 10 years and reflect on the fact that, you know, Mike should be here. Mike should be here. Around that time, I was experiencing my own tragedy, my own personal tragedy. I lost my mother, who had fought stage 4 breast cancer for about 10 years. And I was 17 at the time. And it still bothers me to this day. We just marked 10 years since her death. And
it's like grief melds with grief, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It kind of becomes one river.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And around that time, I was at my grandmother's home, and I had seen a picture of his body on Instagram. And at first, I didn't think it was a real photo. And that's what drove me out there. You know, being a part of the community mourning, we were mourning. We weren't trying to become activists and protesters. And that's something that happened naturally, because when we felt that our community was under attack, we had to stand up. You know, I had to unite with other young people throughout the city. We created a coalition similar to what SNCC did, and we fought back, and that's why I'm here today.
Chief, what about you? We had a chance to talk about this yesterday when we visited in your office. Thank you for that. And you were with the St. Louis County Department at the time. Do you remember where you were, what you heard, and what you thought?
Yes, I was at home at the time. At that time I was a captain with the St. Louis County Police Department. And I remember a good friend of mine, Demetrius Johnson, if you guys are familiar with him, used to host a radio show here, no longer with us here. But he gave me a call, and he said, hey, he used to always call me Captain. He said, hey, Captain, are you aware of what's going on in Ferguson right now? I say, no, not at all. And he started sending me some photographs from social media. And he says, hey, this is going to be a pretty big deal. And, you know, I start making some more phone calls, and I say within the hour, I got a phone call from my chief of police calling all the commanders to work, saying that, hey, we got a problem in Ferguson and we all need to get together. And
why did he know that it was going to be a big deal? How did he know?
Well, I don't know how he knew. I can tell you how I knew. I remember someone making a statement, and I can't recall who it was, but and I can't remember if it was the county chief or the Ferguson chief at the time, but someone made the comment that, hey, look, let's get this investigation going so we can get this officer back on the street. And then when I heard that, I'm like, man, this is going to be a big problem, because I'm in law enforcement, so it gave me the feeling that if we're saying this, it's almost like we're reaching a conclusion before we even doing the investigation. I knew at that point we was going to have some problems.
Brittany, what about you? Do you remember?
I will never forget where I was. On August 9th, I was actually on the other side of the state in Kansas City, Missouri. I had been asked to speak to a group of young women there, a group of Black young women. My mother, Dr. Gwendolyn Packnett, who many of you know from her many years of leadership in this community, had come with me because she had gone to college in Kansas City, and we were going to spend the weekend, make a weekend of it, visit all her old haunts, eat Gates barbecue, remember that it's not as good as St. Louis barbecue. And, we were gonna have a nice girls' weekend. And on August 9th, I gave this talk to these young women, and I felt responsible to tell them how to prepare to be leaders of tomorrow. I got back to the hotel, and I got on Instagram, and I saw a black and white picture of who I now know to be Mike's stepdad, holding a cardboard sign that said, "Ferguson police just killed my unarmed son." One of the pictures, one of the images that really moved me in that moment was seeing pictures that could have been taken in 1964 instead of 2014 of young Black people, elder Black people standing outside of their homes in protest and grief and frustration and confusion as to how not only had Michael Brown Jr. been unarmed and slain, but then had his body lay out in the hot St. Louis August sun for 4.5 hours without being attended to. And in that image, they had been responded to with those same German shepherds and police dogs that we had seen in the mid-century civil rights movement. And I realized in that moment that despite my best efforts, I had lied to those young women the day before, because I told them it was their responsibility to be prepared to be leaders of tomorrow, but there were their peers and younger standing courageously facing down those dogs to demand dignity be conferred on Black people. And so on August 10th, came back here to St. Louis early, went straight over to the Ferguson Police Department to stand in protest with people who are now family. Ran to the Aldi's around the corner to grab a bunch of water for people. Didn't exactly know what the plan was. None of us knew what the plan was, but we were gonna build the plane as we flew it because we had to be present, bear witness, and create, at the very least, a demand for accountability. A friend of mine said, "Hey, some of us are going inside the police department. You run a large organization here. Why don't you come and have this meeting?" And I said, "You tell me what happens afterwards. I know that the place where my feet are supposed to be planted is right here," alongside thousands of other people who, for the next over 400 days, would put their body on the line for Mike and for Von Derrick and for a city and a country and a world to be confronted fully with the voided check that Black people continued to have returned to it. And so, got tear gas for the first time a few days later, and the rest clearly has been history for the past decade.
Zach, what about you? Do you remember where you were and what you thought when you heard what you heard?
I recall very vividly, as someone who had been a St. Louis resident for 20 years at that point and had been involved in the community development space and arena, watched over the next couple of days this very raw and profound exhibition of anger and fear and dread. And it was jarring, and we didn't know where it was going to go, but we knew it was a very important moment.
What about you, Mayor? Do you remember?
I was home, and my telephone rang. It was Patricia Bynes, who at the time was the committee woman for the Ferguson Township Democratic Club. And she called me, she said, Reverend Jones, a young man has been murdered in the streets. I said, has anyone called his mother, his father? Who's there in the family? And she said, at that time, he has been lying in the streets for almost 2 hours. I said, let me make some telephone calls. So I made telephone calls to various people, and they say they were going to go over there. However, I was instructed not to go, and I did not go.
Why so? Can you say why you were instructed not to go?
The leadership was planning to do something different in Ferguson at the time. Let me put it that way. And my instructions were not to go out there because I had other things to do. I hope people can appreciate that. So I had just been appointed to the Ferguson Human Rights Committee. And that was the beginning of the process. Everything has a process. So I did not go, made some telephone calls. So the next day, Patricia called me and said that there is going to be a meeting at the Ferguson Police Department. We want you there. So I got in the meeting, and the chief of St. Louis County, he was in there, Chief Jackson, a couple other people, and they were holding a conversation, and we began to talk, and I told them, I said, the people are standing outside, and at that time, they promised that they were going to bring the people in and talk with them, and they did not. And that was the beginning of people feel like they were not being treated fairly, because if you make a promise and you don't keep that promise, then people don't trust you. That ignited the distrust.
Well, you know, one of the reasons we wanted to bring all of you together on this panel in particular is that all of your lives changed in some way. I don't know if you noticed that's kind of the through line. All of your lives changed in part because of what happened on that day. So I just wanted to start by asking how you think Ferguson changed you. Cliff, did you want to start? Because I mean, for you, it's kind of a dramatic trajectory of where your life, where it's, you know, there's that meme, like where it started, how it's going. You told us earlier, in fact, we were talking earlier, in part, the reason you became a teacher was because of what happened on August 9th. Just briefly, do you want to tell me why?
You know, I'm thinking about a conversation I had with my mentor, one of my mentors, Dr. Clarence B. Jones. He's also the co-writer of the letter from Birmingham jail, and he mentored Dr. King. And I remember him inviting me out to California in 2019, and I was with Bernard Lafayette and many other civil rights activists, some of the Little Rock Nine, and we were just having conversations and heavy conversations, and they asked me, who inspires you? And I'm going to say this, I'm going to say, you know, Michael Vargas inspired me to get into education. Brittany Packnett inspired me to get into education. These folks that I'm having a conversation with right now, Mayor Ella Jones, who's leading in Ferguson, inspired me to get into education. Chief Doyle and what he's doing with trying to bring the community together with community policing, that inspired me to get into education. Because Malcolm X said this. He said, will can't be legislated. Education is the key to that. And so you need folks like myself that look like the children I teach and interact with on a daily basis. You need people like that in the classroom, because if you don't have folks that know them and that can relate to them, you're going to have some dire consequences.
Mm-hmm. Let me go to Brittany on this too, because you also really changed your life in a dramatic way. I mean, you were doing all the things. I mean, you had a big job and a big office and title and so forth. And go ahead, Tufty, you had
I'm
one
going
more
to make a
thing?
correction. Brittany Pagnett Cunningham.
Brittany Pagnett Cunningham.
I mean,
Yes, ma'am. So I was just wanted to ask, like, how do you think one thing led to the other thing?
You know, the interesting part about emphasizing the Cunningham is that I met my husband, who's also a St. Louis native, photographer Reggie Cunningham, in the Ferguson uprising at a protest at the intersection of Shaw and Clem after Von Derek Myers was killed. What changed most about me in this time is something that I think a lot of people don't understand about the uprising, and it is a story I will never stop telling, because a lot of people thought that we were out there day in, day out, after the cameras left, in the organizing meetings, in this church often, and I want to honor Greater St. Mark's and honor the pastor here for continuously providing space. In church basements, sleeping on each other's couches. We were doing all of that stuff for over 400 days, not simply because of what we were fighting against, but because of who and what we were fighting for. And the love that bound us then and that binds us now is perpetually evident in how people have committed to changing this city, to changing our communities, to changing this entire world. Because for me, this is also the 10th anniversary of when I met my now husband. This is the 10th anniversary of when I met people who are so much family to me that they were in my wedding, at my wedding. Clifton was there. This is the 10th anniversary of not only when I met Clifton, but when I, as a Ferguson Commission member, watched as he spoke to a room full of people twice his age with such command, and asked him afterwards what he wanted to do with his life. And he talked about his teacher, Mr. Vargas, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And I honored the commitment and contribution that he made to this community through the classroom. And so then to watch Clifton organize and grow and stand on ABC and ask President Obama a question about our community, and graduate from Howard and pledge Alpha and decide to come right back home and do this work, that is what changed me the most. That is what will forever change this city the most. It bore Action St. Louis, which is setting a national model for what it looks like to invest in your city in the long term and empower people to be in charge of our own destiny. When we talk about the work of Caleb Reed, when we talk about the work of the Organization for Black Struggle, when we talk about the work of the Close the Workhouse campaign, when we talk about our city defenders, we're talking about organizations that either were created during or empowered during Ferguson, and that have continued to change the trajectory of this entire metropolitan area, right? Not only getting our first Black woman mayor elected, but holding her to the promise of closing that jail, and now engaging with community to determine what that space will now become for said community. So I don't want us to miss that, yes, lives changed, trajectories changed. I certainly could not have planned what I would be doing now, but I am forever a protester and forever the proudest member of the Ferguson Uprising family, because what was accomplished here took courage and commitment from people who were being given the least of these. You know, my friend Stephen Bradley, who at the time was a professor at St. Louis University, we were on one of many of these panels at the time, and he said, the young people of Ferguson and of St. Louis reminded America of its duty to protest. That young people across this city, elders, clergy, people across this city stood up day after day after day. And the movement that we saw globally in 2020 in the name of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others would not have happened in the way that it did if it were not for the 400 plus days of the Ferguson Uprising.
We need to take a short break. We hope you'll stay with us. This is Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later from St. Louis Public Radio with NPR News.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later. This is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Michel Martin, host of Morning Edition from NPR News. We're at Greater St. Mark Family Church in St. Louis with a distinguished panel of thought leaders from the area, including Ferguson Mayor Ella Jones, activist, educator, and writer Brittany Packnett Cunningham, Ferguson Police Chief Troy Doyle, educator, Ferguson protester, and our Destiny STL founder, Clifton Kinney, and U.S. Bancorp Impact Finance Chairman and CEO, Zach Boyers. In addition to our panelists, the community is with us to talk about what has and has not changed in the last 10 years. I think Adrienne had a question. Adrienne Williams had a question. She wants first to thank Mike Brown's parents for their courage and steadfast advocacy. She says their sacrifice has led to the judicial reforms passed by the Missouri Supreme Court, which provides material relief to families. But her question is, how do you reconcile Mike Brown with George Floyd, the most recent police killing of Sonia Massey? She's asking, is it reform that's needed, or is it abolition that's needed? Well, why don't we just ask the question, because that is one of the hard questions that's out here before us. Chief, do you want to take that first?
Sure.
No, but you will. But
honestly, obviously there's going to be some disagreements on this. People see, things differently. And we talked yesterday about the how law enforcement came into existence from slave patrols and whatnot. I'm a true believer that law enforcement is no different than any other Fortune 500 company in this nation, meaning that you're always going to have good employees and you're going to have bad employees. I think what we fail at in law enforcement, at least over the years, is identifying who those bad employees were, because we kept silent. We always kept them on the staff because that's how we work, right? What I do know, me being African American, being an African American police chief, raising African American boys, growing up in the west side of St. Louis and moving to North County, I do know that we need law enforcement presence in our community. But that law enforcement presence has to be effective law enforcement presence and good policing. So when people talk to me about, well, we need to abolish the police altogether, I would say that that's not the answer. The answer is our community need law enforcement. We just want to make sure that we have good law enforcement. I mean, to take law enforcement away, I mean, it's just not doable. It's just not good. Now, reform, what Ms. Packett is doing is great with her organization, and there's other organizations. I mean, even the protest movement itself is what got us here today, right? If it wasn't for the protest movement, would police officers be wearing body cams, right? If it wasn't for the protest movement, would we be involved in de-escalation training, crisis intervention training, and so on, right? So it birthed everything that we're doing now as far as reform, birthed from what took place here in the city of Ferguson. To make a long story short, I don't believe in abolishment. However, I do believe in effective law enforcement for our communities.
do you mind if I ask y'all how y'all feel about this? Do any of you believe that the police can be reformed? Do you believe that it's reform? Do any of you believe, if I may ask, that it's just not possible? We have to scrap the whole thing and start over. And some of you believe that that's the case. Would any of you who believe that be willing to say why?
As the chief has spoken, slave patrols and police departments have the same root of the tree. We know that when Ferguson occurred, it became revealed of the militarization of the police. We brought in all kinds of equipment that had come from, we learned about 1033 and bringing in equipment from wars that we had been in other parts of the world. There were a number of police officers and people deployed who were veterans with untreated PTSD. As long as we have qualified immunity, as long as we continue to say that police are in the protection of property and not people, they're not trained for de-escalation, as long as we recognize that the police training here is the same police training that goes on for the IDF, bringing the same type of destruction and death and control. This is a militarized police action that was revealed in 2014 that has been escalating and expanding here in the United States. Now that we've become aware of Project 2025, that is a big foundation for how you control your population. We need to start all over again.
And one more for this lady back here, and then we're going to come back up here. This lady back there, please forgive me for pointing, but that's the only way I can identify you, and then we'll come back here.
So pretty much what I want to say is that how do you retrain a corrupted mindset? With Sonia Massey, when a police officer came to our house, the first thing she said, well, please do not hurt me. And that's very telling when residents are afraid of a police officer. And look what happened. Within not even 5 minutes within her being in her home, she was gunned down because she said, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus.
So, Chief, I think you deserve an opportunity to answer. And then, Brittany, I know you want to get into this conversation too. And I think it's important for those of you who don't know Brittany's record. In part, she was working as one of the co-founders of an organization specifically directed at reducing police violence, and she has some thoughts about that based on research and thought. Chief, I think you deserve the opportunity to respond.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for the questions. So, I mean, Sonia Massey, anyone that followed me on Twitter, if you've seen the tweet that I put out about that.
Tell us what you said.
So when that occurred, I was reading a bunch of tweets from the federal, the police organizations, the FOPs, and some of these law enforcement organizations from across the country who were actually trying to come up with ways on how to justify this. And if you read my tweet, I actually said that those of you who are actually trying to find ways to justify this are part of the problem. And that's exactly what I put out there. That being said, again, I'm gonna stand strong on this. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I got two strong African American police officers that's in here tonight. They're some of my best trained police officers out here. They treat the community with respect. They're out there doing their thing. They're engaging with the kids and whatnot. So I don't think they deserve to be categorized with some of the bad police officers. Trust me. I do know that law enforcement have to do a better job in vetting the people that we hire. We have to, and I haven't even implemented this yet, but we're working on it. We have to work on psychological, we do a psychological exam at hiring, but we do need to do a psychological exam, maybe a couple years after they hire, just to make sure that they're sane, because they're interacting and engaging with our community. Anyway, make a long story short, that, again, I believe that we do need law enforcement in our community. We just need effective law enforcement.
Brittany, you had a thought.
Yeah.
My thought may be different than what people are expecting, because the organization that I co-founded that was really focused on a policy-forward, research-based approach, in part from my experience on President Obama's policing task force, traveling the country, hearing from everyone from families of victims of police violence to rank-and-file police officers to police leadership, et cetera, to mayoral leadership, et cetera. We parted ways in 2020. I decided that the direction of the organization was not in alignment with where I had evolved and where I felt like the movement was evolving.
Well, why don't you tell us where you are now?
Yeah, that's
because we're not going to litigate that either, but tell us where you are now.
Part of the reason why I made that departure was because come 2020, the conversation is defund the police. And a lot of people have maligned that phrase, but it was intentionally provocative to invite us into a question. Two questions, really. One question that I'm grateful I was invited to in that time is, do we want law enforcement or do we want public and community safety? Because the paradigm shift would then dictate a systemic shift, right? Because with all due respect, and I truly do mean all due respect, unfortunately, if we keep getting all these bad apples, the issue is not the apples, it's the barrel, right? So we actually have to look at the entire system. Angela Davis reminds us that all radical means is getting to the root. So how do we actually uproot the thing that was rooted in slave patrols and change our country's approach? Do we want law enforcement or do we want public safety? The other question that I was invited to in that time and that I invite all of us to consider is, do we want accountability or do we want justice? Justice is a living, breathing Michael Brown. Justice is all of us at home watching Netflix right now because Michael Brown is living his life anonymously. His parents are sitting there having dinner with their son. Accountability would have been the officer that killed him being tried. Justice is the living, breathing Sonia Massey. And as someone who advocated for more training, who advocated for body cameras, who advocated for diversifying police departments, who advocated for community policing, who watched millions and millions and millions of dollars be poured into these things only for the police to still be killing as many or more people annually as they were in 2014, our communities deserve us to ask the question, do we want justice or do we want accountability? Because Sonia Massey was murdered on the body camera. So, if we want justice and not merely accountability, that means getting to the root and being brave enough to reconstitute and reimagine what public safety actually looks like in our communities and doing that with the communities. That doesn't mean there's nobody to call when you're in trouble. That doesn't mean that there's no kind of restoration when violence happens. What that does mean is that we invest in communities from the ground up instead of over-police them from the top down. We ensure that the crimes that so often are crimes of lack don't happen because people are able to live in good housing, drink clean water, send their children to good schools, and have living wage jobs. And we invest in the kind of mental health care that ends houselessness, right? We do the things that we know matter from the beginning to actually prevent where we are now, instead of simply hold people accountable once they've done the harm.
So this is a good,
Let me share.
Mayor, this is where I need to come, Mayor, this is where I really need to ask you a question. One of the things that became clear in the wake of the events of August of 2014 and beyond, after the Justice Department came in, one of the things that became very clear is that public safety was being used to generate revenue, right? It was very clear that the tickets, fines, and fees were being used not for reasons of public safety, but to generate revenue for the government. So, Mayor, I need to ask you, the population of Ferguson is declining, okay? And that means that property tax falls and retail taxes falls. Given that, how do you raise revenue in that situation?
Well, back in 2014, the police department budget was driven by the finance director. And the finance director will always go to the police department and say, you need to create more funding. And at that time, if you look in the budget, Ferguson budget from ticketing was about $3 million. Since then, when the Department of Justice came in and took a look at Ferguson practices, they found numerous things wrong. Number one, it was the fact that the finance director was driving the budget for the police department. That had to be corrected. And from the DOJ department, DOJ coming in, we had to have an analysis of the Ferguson Police Department, and Peter Belmio, he came in and he did the analysis of the Ferguson Police Department, and he found things that they were doing or they were not doing correctly.
Yeah, well, we know that, Mayor. So the question, that was very clear. They had emails back and forth from the city officials to the police chief saying, can you raise us more money? So we know that this is true. The question is, what now? Now that you understand that that's wrong, now that you understand it's unconstitutional, now that it's been made public, but you still have declining revenues because you have a loss of population, what do you do?
Well, the population has declined. In the city of Ferguson in 2010, the population was 21,257. In 2020, the population was 18,500 plus. We have taxed as much as we can tax. So, under Chief Troy Doyle leadership is that you cannot, and I shared this, you cannot come in the city of Ferguson and do wrong and speed and expect that it's okay. You must respect the laws that are here. That's number one. Number two, if a person is stopped, they are treated with respect at this point. I say that because a lady called me and say she was speeding down Elizabeth. The speed limit on Elizabeth is 25 miles per hour, and she was doing 40. And the police pulled her over and asked her, did she realize she was speeding? She said no. They got into a conversation. He gave her his card, his name, and they talked. He did not give her a ticket, but he warned her that be more mindful that you're driving 25 miles per hour. And 2014, she would have gotten a ticket. In 2024, it was a decent conversation from the officer to the person driving the car. She didn't feel like she was treated unfairly because she called me and told me of a good experience she had with the officer. And Ferguson has a program. If you find someone doing good, then you try to work with them, award them. And she said the officer gave her a gift certificate because they were able to have a decent conversation.
Okay,
that's up here. That's up here.
Right.
From what
I understand.
Was.
Okay, but let me go to Zach. Maybe you can help us with the financial aspect of it, okay? Because I think it's important on the one hand to acknowledge that this behavior was racist, this behavior was unconstitutional, but it was also driven in part by money, okay? All right, Mr. Zach, show us the money. Where is it? You said, look, I'm just going to tell you something that you said you said at one point, we believe banks are in business to do three things: economic development, workforce development, and community development. And you think about like bringing those things together. I just want to know, what does a community like Ferguson need to thrive?
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, humbled to be on the stage with these great leaders. And I would just say, the Ferguson Commission did us a really amazing, did for our community a really amazing thing. And I want to thank Brittany, as I have in the past, because what it did was describe the scale and the scope of the challenge, and identified very clearly that one sector, one industry, one person for sure could not possibly turn the tide all the way. However, it did name accountable bodies very discreetly for certain areas that it could in fact impact. And so, what I will say is that it was an essential tool for us to question how we do our work, how the system is working or not working for certain segments of the population. And it did, in fact, catalyze significant change in how we think about our lending and investing practices, and fundamentally challenged us to ask, who's it for? It led us to develop actual measures of impact that we invest in and use to this day in order to understand if the desired outcomes are in fact manifesting or not. And perhaps even more importantly, to iterate and do it better.
Can I just ask you, why did it take that to come to those conclusions? This is what I don't understand. Like, was it a surprise that some people were being invested in and others weren't? Was it a surprise that some people had access to capital and other people didn't? You see, I'm just curious, like, because people have been critical of the protests. They say, oh, they were leaderless, they went on too long, yep. Why can't you all let it go? But what I'm hearing you say is until those protests happened, people weren't doing those things. So why?
I honestly do believe that I think a level of intentionality got created by the catalyst that was not only the uprising, but also the conversations in the community that came out of it. Again, I'm going to give credit to the commission for listening and centering the voices of impacted populations and amplifying them in ways that just had not been done. Should it have happened earlier? Should change have begun more materially earlier? Of course, absolutely. And in all humility, I would say we've still got a long way to go. But being deliberate, creating intentionality, understanding how systems work, whether it's a system of policing or a system of financial services or how healthcare is required if we're going to actually make progress and change it.
We need to take a short break. We hope you'll stay with us. This is Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later from St. Louis Public Radio with NPR News.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later. This is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Jamil wants to know, what do we need to do in Ferguson and our North County region to get folks registered and actively voting? Protesting is cool and serves a purpose, but who your elected officials are matter. Who's serving on boards and commissions matter. It takes a village. What about that? I mean, I'm mindful of the fact, and this is not a partisan statement, it's just an observation, it's a reported fact, that the person who was in leadership at the time of Michael Brown's death was in that job for 6 more years before the voters made a different choice. And I just wonder why it took so long. So Clifton, maybe you want to talk about that.
No, seriously. It matters who's in that seat. It matters. And I just want to speak to something at the federal level, all right? Right now we have a really important race happening in 3 months. On one side, there's a guy that says police should have full immunity, right? On the other side, they're saying at least we should investigate, right? You have one side that says that police should be allowed to have militarized weapons, and then you have another side that says, let's pull that back.
I can't listen to this anymore. Kamala was a mass incarcerator in California.
Okay. Okay.
And no one came to protest it in the backyard of Ferguson. We could have changed the trajectory right here.
That's
okay.
Right.
We would have stood up
That's
to
right.
Greg Happy of mass incarceration who kicked black men as welfare and crime.
That's right.
Okay.
That's
and
right.
now you got a first generation during sociopath who laughed about locking us up and then prison.
Okay, I'm just going to ask you, what is your question? What is your...
Her anger.
Okay, then you don't have to.
That's real. That's real. That's right.
They are fulfilling us for bad things.
That's right. That's real.
Well, our people have no money. We can't fund campaigns.
That's real.
We have no one to vote for.
That's right.
At the top of the ticket, what happened to the whole damn system is
It is. And that's why it matters who we put in that seat. It is.
I think we
I
have
agree.
Maya.
66 black families a month are getting priced out of our city. I am so hurt about this.
I get it.
Backyard of Ferguson, and you're gonna toll police me?
Sis, your anger is justified, man.
That's enough. We've heard you, and I'm asking you to hear everybody else.
Sis, your anger is justified. We want to talk about it.
Yeah, we want to.
Can we just, it is.
You know, that pain, that anger, that's real. That's real.
All right.
Let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge that we were brutalized on those streets for 400 days. Let's acknowledge that.
To the brother's question, though, because if we're community, I want to recognize that you asked the question.
Where?
And I do think that one of the things that was powerful about not just the Ferguson uprising, but really protest movements all around the country is a lot of civic education happened person to person. Because we know, unfortunately, a lot of that has been defunded in our schools. And so a lot of people got educated on all of the roles that dictate our future, not just the White House, not just Congress or the Senate. People got educated on what city councils are doing, what school boards are doing, who's your recorder of deeds, like all of these little roles that people didn't know about. A lot of that civic education happened peer to peer. So to your question, I think one of the things that we can do as community members is take the opportunities of influence that we have, because we call famous people influencers, but all of us are influencers. All of us influence somebody. If you teach Sunday school, there can be civic education there. If you the candy lady, there can be civic education when they come by their lollipops. If you coach basketball, there can be civic education there. I think we have to use every opportunity we can to make sure that people, all of our people, are empowered to understand exactly who is making decisions about our future and how we ensure that they don't make decisions without us.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Nicole Reed Hutcherson Adewale. I say my full name to honor my ancestors. I had a different question in mind, but what I want us to discuss, you mentioned a St. Louis plan, and then there's all kinds of different plans out here, but the woman who spoke up, there's so many people whose voices have not been heard, so many people who do not have a platform. They don't have a circle of accountability. How do we build these better connections in our community so that A, people feel like they're heard, but B, we are hearing what people are going through so that we can make some better change?
Like Clifton said, these emotions are real and justified, and they come from a place that we have to honor, to your exact point. I remember the night after Darren Wilson was not indicted, and that night rather, right around the Thanksgiving holiday. And I don't think anybody who was out in the streets can ever forget that night. And I got a call early in the morning, to your point about platform. I got a call at about 2 a.m. asking me to be on Good Morning America. So I literally took a cold shower to wash the tear gas out of my eyes and went over across town to the parking lot of the Ritz-Carlton, quite a different scene, and talked to George Stephanopoulos. And I remember people kept sending me talking points of things they wanted me to say. And I was like, cool, thank you, but no thank you. Because what we had heard that night, that grief that had poured out, that angst that had poured out, that anger that had poured out, it's justified. And if we do not honor that, we cannot, to your point, act on making it any better. So what I didn't even use my own words. I used Dr. King's words, and people like to forget these particular words from Dr. King, but what I said was a riot, and that's not my language, but his. A riot is the language of the unheard, right? So if you saw certain things last night, I want you not to be mistaken about what you saw. right? You all can vilify black people all you want, but that's what was happening. And I remember the amount of disdain I received for saying that, which was a reminder to me that not only are people attempting to silence the truths that we are uncomfortable with, coming from folks that we would much rather marginalize, we are then also sidelining the people who are bold and courageous enough to do something about it. The people who will run for office for those folks, the people who will take the positions and stop being in lucrative careers for it, right? The people who will sacrifice their safety to say it out loud and on television and on a bullhorn and all those kind of things. And so I think part of what we have to do is, as communities, give each other the cover, to your point, to be able, the space to be able to hear, which this church has continuously done, and the cover for the folks who are out there trying to do something about it. One of the ways that has been happening is through electoral justice. So to your point earlier, ma'am, Action St. Louis is one of the organizations that will actually not only register you to vote, but pay you to become a canvasser, pay you a living wage to become a canvasser. They were knocking on doors of black voters years ago who, when they answered the door, folks said, nobody comes and knocks on my door. Nobody comes over here to Kinloch. Nobody comes over here to Ferguson. Nobody comes over here to Ferg Floor. Nobody was knocking on my door until you all came. And not only am I gonna listen to you because you knocked on my door, I'm going to engage with you. And now they're the people knocking on other people's doors. You see what I'm getting at? That building effect is what happens when we hear each other and we actually give each other the cover and the space and the resources to go do something about it. And so, and I want to acknowledge that this moment, especially for black women, is very, very tough. I refuse to watch the body cam footage of the murder of Sonia Massey, because I know that if I open that dam of tears, it is not closing. And so, in as much as it can be frustrating and difficult to hear and to listen when the words that are spoken or the way that it's expressed is not what we would prefer, we have to decide to let down our defenses enough to say, let me hear the roots of what you're coming from, right? Let me hear the emotion attached to it, because on that level we can relate, and then we can build from there.
I'd like to thank our panelists, Ferguson Mayor Ella Jones, activist, educator, and writer Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, Ferguson Police Chief Troy Doyle, educator, Ferguson protester, and our Destiny STL founder, Clifton Kinney, and U.S. Bancorp Impact Finance Chairman and CEO, Zach Boyers. And thank all of you in the audience for joining us today and for sharing your reflections. As we close, I'd like to invite spoken word artist and poet Pacia Elaine Anderson to share her original piece, Future Memory.
There is an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Together. Together to gather. As we gather in Sankofa, in acknowledgement of the thousands of years predating life on this continent, the building of civilizations that were harmonious in their formation before the prominence of the concept of dominance, of the history of violence against us and its consequence, the ruining of communities, the leveling of legacies, the imposition on our traditions, the attempted erasure of our innocence, and while together, let us too not forget those upon whose shoulders we now stand. Those who resisted, died, legislated, and planned. Those tacticians with vision that circulated those petitions. Those who built coalitions to bring justice to fruition as we gather going far and not alone. Let their names be the ones that rest upon our lips. Let their example be the archetype of how to courageously live a marvelous life, not as walking great mistakes, but as vessels of healing, living liberation in our wake together. Ah, yes, as we gather, each bearing the weight of our own stories. For we are all a collection of pasts, of circumstances gathered, of lifetimes whose lifeline threads our history together. For we are all that we have ever been, and at once none of it anymore. For we are reborn every second that we accept that we transform through breath and through rest and through test and through quest. With open hands of prayer and praise, we as fluid as water, us as limitless as sky, as grounded as the ground is, we are ground in, rooted in this community, together, gathering in love and strength and empathy as the warmth of your grandmama's hands rub the sickness from your bodies. As the light in our children's eyes connect us to the child behind our own. As the rhythm in our soul dances down that which was meant to break us. As the spirit of Harriet and Du Bois and Nzinga and Dixon guides us to forge our way through, gathering together, going further than we could ever imagine, while holding on to one another as though our lives depend on it, because in this society, it so often does. Together, building bridges as we walk across them, learning to grow into whom we want to become while shedding the identities of people we never were. We are both the seen and the invisible. Caged birds no longer, war-painted wings gliding on wings of change. We who have existed everywhere from the start of every beginning. We who carry the history of the entire universe deep in our bones, the conduits of destiny, the keepers of all that is divine, as we struggle against those who can only be at peace when they are at war, we still effortlessly reflect what it means to truly be human, what it means to be because someone else was, because someone else gathered together in a time before, and we here now stand tall, a new picture created from the singular parts of ourselves, collectively crafted together, going as far as we can go, and definitely going as far as we may have to. Gathered in justice, gathered in healing, gathered in community, gathered together. Ashe. Sante Sana, Mama Bosman.
Ferguson and Beyond, a community conversation 10 years later, is a production of St. Louis Public Radio with NPR. Thank you for listening. I'm Michel Martin.
In cooperation with NPR, Ferguson and Beyond was produced by Elaine Shaw, with audio mixing and editing by Emily Woodbury, and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our audio engineer was Ryan Schulte. Special thanks to Maya Norfleet, Brian Heffernan, Jonathan All, Chad Davis, Brian Munoz, Leslie Davis, Sophie Brose, and Fontella Bradford. From NPR, thanks to Michel Martin, Erica Aguilar, and Lindsay Toddy, and to everyone else who helped make this event happen. Our thanks also to Greater St. Mark Family Church. The executive producer was Alex Hoyer.